The one that really stands out for me is the case of the Saudi women's rights activist whose phone was hacked with Pegasus, which is why that excuse that NSO Group and others use is so specious. You know, don't worry, nothing to see here because we only sell it to governments to be used for crime or terrorism. It's not a good way to think about the limits of this type of technology.
How do you see the industry evolving from here?
If we succeed, you could imagine a much different environment 10 years from now where there is robust oversight mechanisms and much more transparency. That would be my ideal world. The way things are going, though, frankly frightens me because we live in a time where there's obvious, well-documented democratic backsliding. Authoritarian practices are spreading worldwide. I firmly believe the surveillance industry, unchecked as it is one of the major contributing factors to those trends.
What is your feeling on how much ability the U.S. government should have to purchase this kind of tech?
First of all, it would be a very serious mistake to simply prohibit the purchase of the technology. We need our experts to know what is out there. I have no objection to the FBI purchasing the technology to understand it. Then comes the more complicated question of, do we want the FBI to be able to use it?
Do you think the answer is a ban on the operational use of foreign commercial spyware by the U.S. government?
No. No, absolutely not. The answer is do the hard work of assuring that law enforcement uses it consistent with our civil liberties. We're using a lot of abstractions here right now. I have 2 daughters. What if one of my daughters were kidnapped? I want that tool. I want that tool.
I think what is making Israel so important in this destruction industry is that they have a huge laboratory to work in. And they are using the Palestinian people to do their tests, and then they sell it to the rest of the world.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Abarca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson. We're online at Whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Abarca. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. We also have shirts, and if you'd like a shirt merch, you can always contact Andy about that through our website. All right. Well, it seems like we are finally doing what I had suggested and you were reluctant to do, which is our film review on the film that's called Surveilled.
Yeah.
And so that's what we'll be discussing today.
And you had to make sure to let people know that I was reluctant to do this.
You were reluctant to do it, and you actually made me change an episode about it, which I still have in my pocket for when I need it. So when I say we're going to do this, and you say no, I say yes, this is why. That's how these things work. For people who have co-hosts, that's how you get them. All right, good. So, right. So, Surveilled. We have filmmaker Matthew O'Neill and journalist, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ronan Farrow, who is presenting what this film is about, and it's about where high-tech surveillance spyware threatening people's privacy as well as large, not just governments, but just as well people with money. It's Ronan Farrow, himself was spied on by, I don't think he says who, but he was definitely being tracked by spyware after his release or before his release of his article on sexual allegations or abuse by Harvey Weinstein and other folk.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything?
Well, I think the movie specifically starts with talking about the company NSO, which is a Israeli surveillance or spy company, essentially, which produces uh, the program Pegasus. And he's looking, he's talking to the people in the company, saying, "Hey, do you know that this stuff could be misused by Middle Eastern countries or African countries, and now even Western countries? Are you assured that they're using this just against it's supposedly stuff to fight terrorism and to fight crime, and maybe like pedophilia and things like that, which I guess is crime. But there's a lot of evidence that it gets used for much more than that. And I think the one case that seems to upset some of the workers at NSO was the Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi, the idea that Pegasus software might have been used to track him and ultimately help Saudi Arabia murder him. So that was something else that I would say was in it. Yeah. So yeah.
So I guess let's start off with our first impressions. What did you take away? Like what was the impact after having watched it? And you watched it with Brandy, yes?
Yeah, I did. But so I didn't like this movie. I felt like I told Brandy that to me this looked like access journalism. This looked like a person who was not prepared to really deal with this subject matter because I don't think they even know. Like they're dealing with, in my opinion, he's kind of dealing with the very tip of the iceberg. He's not even exposing the things that had already been exposed back in 2010, like this kind of stuff that he's talking about. Like, hey, do you know that some people, like, and specifically the concern he had with the fact that politicians, and of course he said activists and things like that, but powerful people are being spied on wrongly, and then of course maybe it might trickle down to regular people like activists and things like that. But like the surveillance that he's talking about to me is like a thimble of water in a river of surveillance that's actually going on when you think about what was revealed by Edward Snowden, that not just our metadata is being collected, but internet, like everything is being collected. Like that's the whole point. And to think that you're going to look at this commercial program like that's being done by a private company and how it's being used by governments and avoid the fact that the major governments of this country, of the world, have their own programs that surveil everyone, both legally and illegally. And in relationship to the U.S. relationship with Google and Palantir and how all that stuff was exposed, well, partly exposed or revealed during COVID. This was just really weak. Like one of the things I was asking myself is, would I want my students, like, would this be the way I would introduce to my students the idea of surveillance? And I wouldn't. Like, one, I feel like it's only dealing with the tip of the iceberg. And secondly, so many times he spent so much time talking to the politicians or to the people who are apologizing for this thing and giving really like very pat answers of, well, we have to do it. The genie's out of the bottle, or we're trying to fight terrorism. And, well, we can't really stop this stuff. We give it to those countries. We don't know what they're going to do with it. And he spent like most of this movie is spent talking to those people and having them defend this. So for me, given the problem that we're dealing with, I just think Ronan Farrow, I just think he was way out of his league, like in terms of dealing with this. I don't think he's trying to be an apologist for this stuff, but as deeply problematic as surveillance and digital, how much the digital world has crept into our lives, this guy's barely dealing with, in my opinion, if it's a football field, he's barely dealing with an inch, and that inch he dealt with, he made it very like he was very weak in his interrogation of the people who were putting forward these who were saying that they were going to use these programs. So I was pretty frustrated watching it. I was kind of bored because I feel like I know most of this stuff, and I feel like it's again it was very surface, and it didn't do a very good job showing people how deeply penetrated our lives already are. This isn't just happening to a few people or a few politicians or just the family members of what was that group? What was the Citizen group?
Citizen Lab.
Citizen Lab. Like when their family members got nailed, and had the Pegasus program was being used on them. Like, yeah, okay, that's just the tip of the iceberg, though. And so I felt it was a very weak dealing and with this issue. And frankly, I'm surprised that Derek Brose would recommend this movie. Like, I thought he would recommend something that would be much more penetrating than this, and it wasn't for me.
Well, I'm right here in Mexico, um, where I'm at. It's known now after investigations reveal that Mexico is the first and most prolific user of Pegasus, uh, and has been surveilling the Zapatistas in Chiapas, the state of Chiapas, and also journalists as well as judges and lawyers and uh, people such as activists as well. So I had some high stakes in it, for wondering if there was something I would be able to learn more of. Uh, since I'm here, it kind of gave me a little bit of a scare to think that I might be surveilled, or I don't know. Sometimes I have these crazy dreams about hit jobs and all this stuff. So I it's not far fetched, by the way. It does happen. It happens in lots of countries.
Yeah.
Um, so uh, I was expecting for a further in-depth investigation. That's something I would learn, something more than what we have been introducing. I think that some of our What's Left episodes actually go farther than this documentary does. Because
By far, like
yeah,
way, yeah.
yeah, if anyone look at even Alison McDowell's work,
Oh God.
or even some of the things that we have just mentioned, that happens with beyond Pegasus, even just biometrics and at the border, and even it just our lives are entangled with, if we just look at digital IDs, for example, right? It's not just spyware, it's also what we have to do, mandated to go and report our lives on a database to be surveilled beyond just our phones. So I was a bit um, disappointed afterwards, hoping that there would be something more or a solution. And neither was there for me. I think it was sort of the beginner's guide or 101 kind of thing for people if they wanted to be informed about. But the only solution I think he said was, and this is a spoiler, we would have to run our lives without our phone.
Well,
That's what he said.
and I would say that's the solution that really resonated with me when he had finally said at the
Yeah.
end, maybe we'll have to do that, like almost like a threat to people. But that's the only solution I do think. He did put forward a solution of reform, of regulation, and
Mm.
saying that if we can just get these governments to spell out how they're going to use this, then, because that was the criticism he was raising to the government officials. You're saying you're doing this, but you're not spelling out how you're using it, and you're not spelling out what the bars are, or like what the boundaries are on it. And I like he thinks that those people are going to do that. Like, and he kept on talking about the Biden administration, coming out and saying we're not going to use NSO or the Pegasus because that had been
The ban.
yeah, we're banning that. And then later he realizes, well, they're not banning other ones, and it doesn't say anything about their own commercial, their own stuff that they use. Like, and he was actually interviewed by somebody, and they were like, well, yeah, the government's not going to use Pegasus, but they already got their own thing. And Ronan didn't know what to say. It's like he's like, oh, and the fact is the genie's out of the bottle, like one of the politicians said, and they're going to use that as a cover. But it's I think so. He did have a reform. He just thinks that there's some sort of government regulation that could be trusted. That's what I would say.
Mhm. One thing I was continuously rolling my eyes over, and it's not to think that I don't think these are important, but the criminals, it's the terrorists, the pedophiles,
Yeah.
it's North Korea, it's the Chinese, it's all these other, the Iranians. These are the terrorists. These are the people that we have. This is the reason why we have a moral obligation to have this spyware and to, I mean, even Representative Jim Himes kept saying that we have to have it. We just cannot ban it. We cannot live without it. He's a Democrat, by the way.
Yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, wow, this is so much. What do you call it? This is what people do to manipulate, right? It's the boogie person, right? It's the boogeyman. You have the immigrants, like I kept saying, or you have a health scare, or you have terrorism, or you have, the guns, or the war on drugs. These are the things that we have to be careful of. This is what motivates, what people try to use as a smokescreen, right? To try to trick us into accepting what is to come or what governments want to do toward the masses. And so every time I kept hearing the criminals and more good is done and we have to do all this, I kept thinking, my God, that's one thing I kept, it was reinforcing. It's not something I hadn't already known.
Right.
It just reinforced what I kept thinking about, how much people are manipulated to believe what things are necessary for. So I mean, I don't think I learned anything new. The only one other, there was another, and I have to look for it. And I'll put it here in these minutes. Um, the spyware, the other name for the other spyware, which starts with a K, I think it was.
Oh,
But
Kundari.
there you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other than Pegasus, that was the only other name I had learned in the
Right.
in the documentary. But I think it's a good starter. I don't think it goes enough, and I don't think this is where I don't think this is the documentary we need to use. I think Edward Snowden did us a favor already, and this was sort of back when,
Right.
it's like, or even you think of Julian Assange, also has already revealed. So I don't think that this is much to learn from. So I'm concerned that this is where it stops. This is how much uh, praise has given to. Like, we don't have more to give to the public, which is what I think we're doing. I think that's the work we're doing. Honestly, I kept thinking to myself, we've covered a little bit more than this on what's left. On AI, there was no mention of AI.
Yeah, I mean the fact that his whole story takes place or starts in Israel, and the fact that by he's putting this out. In fact, he has the thing at the end where he's talking after the October 7th, Hamas, what happened with Hamas and Hamas attack, and then of course Israel, going blasting Gaza. He doesn't. He talks about Pegasus being used there. He earlier talked about how the Palestinian people are lab rats for Pegasus, and that's a good thing to reveal. I mean, that's something
Yes.
that is important. But then when he mentions the post 1023 or the post 10 October 7th stuff, he talks about Pegasus being used to find hostages or to get the hostages. He completely ignores Lavender and any of that stuff. Like, are you telling me you don't even know about that? Like, that's why, like, how can you even mention about hostages when right now, there's AI being used to identify people and kill people in a program called Where's Daddy? Which things like programs like Pegasus are connected to that kind of stuff. So it's pretty incredible. I'd almost call him a limited hangout, like a person who's putting something out there I would call him a limited hangout. I don't know if he knows that. He's just way out of his league. He doesn't even know the material he's dealing with, I feel like. So he's the wrong person to reveal this problem, because he doesn't, in all instances, he is he is only showing the tip of the iceberg, and always giving the people who are creating the problem the last word on talking about it. And so I felt I would not recommend that somebody see this. I wouldn't to a person who who didn't think surveillance was a problem. This is not the thing I would show them to try to open the conversation. Because frankly, I think they'd come out there being like, well, what are you going to do? Like that guy said, what if your daughter was kidnapped? It's like, oh, come on, like that's what the one US guy said. If I know you don't want us to use these programs, but if my daughter's kidnapped, we're going to use these programs. And it in no way, in my opinion, is a documentary preparing people to understand the scale of the problem, or even give them the basis for pushing back against the talking points used by the ruling class.
Yeah. There's so much to cover: facial recognition, artificial intelligence. There's the government issuing IDs and passports and what we have to do. Like there's some. I didn't feel like they had covered how much we're surveilled, in what way, tapped on our phones,
Yeah.
phone lines.
And I don't think he went to those interviews with these high level officials in any way prepared. Like, I think I was thinking about 60 Minutes, which again is just mainstream propaganda media.
Yeah.
But at least those folks came prepared with questions that were going to be potentially difficult for those people to answer. He didn't even come prepared with any difficult questions for these people. Like it was like he was just kind of putting microphones in front of people. But if you think about it, most of the people who he talked to were elites. And that's why, and the reason I call it access journalism is I felt he was always trying to basically say, I'm not a threat to you. I'm not going to question you. And therefore you can let me talk to you. And that's not good journalism.
Maybe that's why they allowed him to speak with them.
Yeah. It's like they knew he wasn't going to be a threat. And, I don't know what the work he did around Harvey Weinstein. I imagine it was more pointed. But if he goes on and actually goes deeper into this in some later date, then I'll have a different thought about him at least. But right now, I think he took on a subject matter he was in no way capable of really giving people a sense of what's happening, and the scale of what's happening, and frankly, making us go back in time. And he's doing this 13 years after the revelations of NSA collecting everything on the American population, and he doesn't even talk about that. And it's really interesting to me that he chooses, as a person in the United States, to deal with a software that is only going to be used to surveil people outside the United States. Like, why did you make that choice? Are you trying to say this isn't happening in the United States? It's very interesting because this is HBO. I mean, maybe he's thinking, well, this is going to go to Britain and this is going to Spain and da-da-da-da. And in fact, the what was the group again? Citizen what?
Citizen Lab.
Citizen Lab did their exposure that I think Ronan Farrow was part of it, or at least he highlights some of that, did seem to make a big splash in Spain. It did make a big impact there, on the surveilling of people in the Catalonian independence movement. But what are you doing really trying to reach a US audience talking about the surveillance that's going on in other countries? And also, if you notice, he even himself was like, well, what's happening in the Middle East? Are there Middle Eastern countries you're selling this to? Are there African countries you're selling this to? And kind of already implying that there's a difference between how they'll use it versus the Western countries. There were so many biases that he revealed of his own. And later, of course, he said, well, Western companies are using it bad too. Like, oh, surprise, surprise. They are the biggest problem. These are the people who created this stuff. So they didn't create this so that African warlords can go surveil. They created this so that they can rule over their own population, you idiot. So it was very frustrating. And I did not know that Pegasus was I would have loved to hear about how Pegasus was being used. Not love to hear it, but that would have been interesting to hear about Pegasus being used here and in Mexico. He needed to do way more research on this to show the breadth, at least of that one program. And then you have to come back and say, this stuff is going on in the United States, and here's how. And it's not happening through Pegasus, it's happening through this medium, like the kind of programs that Edward Snowden revealed, like Prism and things like that, which is Prism is more of a program of internet surveillance. But there are other things that were done that were part of metadata collection and things like that were done that Edward Snowden revealed as well. And supposedly the US has stopped collecting that metadata on our phones. But what reason do we have to believe that? So it was.
I mean,
Yeah,
he
go
could
ahead.
have gotten further into law enforcement and how it's being used here in the USA.
Yeah, and
And so-
do you remember at one time he kind of said like, "Hey, I'm pretty sure that these law enforcers are just wanting to do it to use criminals, but do they understand that this thing could be abused?" And it's like, why would you believe this? Like, why are you saying that? Why are you saying things like I believe, that they're just trying to use it to catch criminals, but it could be abused. And it's like you're starting this from a very strange place, Like I don't know why you would. I mean, again, he's a liberal. I guess that's what that is. And he doesn't. I was joking with Brandy. He's a good-looking guy. We get to see him a lot. It did seem promotional for him by the end, but it certainly doesn't make him look like a very good journalist, in my opinion. It makes him look like a very, in my opinion, weak journalist who's not going to interrogate power in any real meaningful way.
It's I would have liked to have seen a whistleblower or someone that was further shared about their lives more than just, the person in Citizen Lab in Spain, someone here on the ground in USA. Well, I'm not in the USA, but over there. And I guess with what we have of the film and what was shared with us, I mean, I guess the next question I think we should delve into is, what are the further implications? I kept thinking to myself, my goodness, I have thought about this already, but I had said this years ago on What's Left, and I said, I get afraid sometimes to think that a revolution could get started, but then dismantled through the use of tech. And if we see, the 6th of January, or we see Catalonia's, uprising, or even what happened in the Middle East, these are the things that kind of I think about all the time when I think about starting or some movement, some working class movement gets started. So I think if you can state what you think about that, or
Well, that's the part that was interesting to me that Ronan and Farrow said at the very end, which is we may have to get rid of all our phones. That really is going to have to happen. Like if we're going to resist the system. And I mean, I think what actually happened with the was it no, it was with Hezbollah, where these pagers and various electronic devices were used to just blow up on people. Like I think that's endemic of the relationship we're going to need to have to this kind of tech if a genuine resistance movement is going to fight back against powers that are trying to fight them. Like again, and I want to make a distinction between, I think you can have your phone and use this stuff while we build alternatives, but when the time comes to defend that alternative and there becomes a battle, there becomes a civil war, or whatever you want to call it, between two different systems, I think we're going to have to not use our phones at that point, because that medium is not ours. So I think Ronan Farrow came to the solution. I don't know if he was trying to like scare people with that or just say, man, I don't know. Like, I think innately he realized that this is too big to rein in just by a regulation or something. So that to me is what resonated the most, is when he made that final statement of like, we may have to get rid of all our phones. And at one level, you could be like, "Oh, is that crazy?" But like, I mean, Eduardo, you and I grew up with no phones, with no mobile phones. It's a fairly new development, so it's not impossible, and not of course it's not impossible. It's not that crazy to think we could go back to something else, and internally have to build a different way of a communication system, in also building an alternative kind of society that is trying to replace whatever we're being pushed into. And because again, I think when I used to talk about resistance, I used to really think first and foremost of taking down the government, taking down the institutions. And now I do have to remember that there's no point in taking any institutions down if you have nothing to replace it with. And so the first step are building our own institutions. And we can have phones while we do that for some time. But at some point, the question of being penetrated and being vulnerable to our enemy is going to come up, particularly when it's a conflict that takes on an actual clash. And then at that point, we will have to get rid of our phones. We'll have to get rid of the internet, and we'll have to find another way of communicating. That seems fairly clear to me.
It's crazy to think that we could go back to those times.
We will have to.
I was over the weekend. I went camping in the state of Querétaro, and it was a weekend, and there wasn't any signal, and it was just a tent, fire, and just us four, my cousin Diane and her partner, and I had thought about maybe it's in bits and moments, what would it be like if we went back to this? How much the levels of stress, or just how much my life would be off grid. And now that you mention it, that just came to me. That would probably have to be the next way to go about a working class movement, because it is so embedded now with government and companies collusion of how they would manage workers. I don't even believe anymore so many of the cryptic messages that Facebook says, or Apple says, or Google, or Microsoft, and Silicon Valley's ways to combat all this. I don't know if they're selective. I think that that's what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And if the government is going to impose themselves onto these tech companies, they're going to do it, and they're going to sell information. So maybe not even sell it, just by law, you have to just give it up, even if it is saying on the privacy notice that you're not supposed to give those things up. So, yeah, it's not to be trusted. We're not at that point there yet, but if we had to, yeah, I think I would have to do that. I would have to give it up.
Yeah, and I think if we knew that our survival of the kind of world we were creating was counting on that, I don't think it would be all that hard. Honestly, I don't. I just think it's impossible to do it in their system because their system is built on this. It's like it's in the veins of it. So uh, I think so. One thing I remember talking with Brian Belknap, a friend of mine, who had previously done an episode called "Raised by Wolves." If people want to check it out, is he often would say, "Well, maybe we could, you could have radical tech people who would be hackers, and they could turn this thing over our way." My problem with that is it basically once again it requires a group of specialists that you can trust. And I don't believe in that society. Like I don't believe in that revolutionary society that requires a group of specialists that are going to make it possible for us to get there. The society that I would believe in, that's truly revolutionary, that is truly something different, is going to be something that requires everyone to be a participant, and it uses people's bodies and minds to construct it. If it's just based on a few people's expertise, then it can go away like that. Eugene Debs had a quote. Eugene Debs is a famous socialist from the United States who was also a trade unionist and had led railroad strikes and things like that, ran for president from jail, and had basically said, any promised land that I can deliver you to is one that I can also take you out of. And so he was very much against the notion of like, I'm going to lead you to some place as a revolutionary leader. And I really believe that that's true, not just for an individual. It's even true for like, if our revolution counted on an elite cadre of tech hackers who could be super committed, it's not a question of them not being committed. But if our revolution requires some small group to perform some action in order for it to take place, then I don't believe it's a revolution that will actually change society, because the changing of society is not by changing the form. It's us taking actions into our own hands, and by doing so, we ourselves are changed in saying, "Hey, society will look a certain way because I'm making it look that way, because I'm putting work into it, I'm shaping it." And unless people have that experience collectively, then we're just recreating the same wheel, same problem of hierarchy, in my opinion.
Different from what some people might say, that socialism uh, perpetuates laziness, and that you have to just, you're waiting for the government to take care of you, which I've had people in my life say that to me, that that's what socialism perpetuates. And
Well,
I think it does require people to participate. What we're going to say.
well, you can, and in some ways, you can kind of see where people have got that vantage point, because when we talked about socialists and communists' connection to tech, a lot of it is from this notion of this like tech creating this kind of utopia for us that we can just kind of hang out inside of. And that notion of a revolutionary society is sort of a no work society. It's like, let's let the robots do all the work, you know? And if it's a no work society, then it's a no action society. And if it's a no action society, then there's no change. I mean, Marx was very clear, like that in order to get rid of the muck of all the previous histories that taught us that we were no good, or taught us racism or sexism, all those things that divide us and also teach us to be complacent and stay put. The act of learning, of the way you're going to learn that something's different, is not in a book, and it's not something somebody can give you. It will be from an act of the working class itself. Like the act of revolution is an act of the working class itself. And so workers are going to have to create their world. And if they don't create their world, then it doesn't exist. It's like, then it can't possibly be revolutionary. So yeah, it requires us to do something. Like, it's the act of doing something that is part of our transformation, not just of the world itself, but of us. So I think I get it why people think that socialists are just saying no work, because we have started to say that in our notion of tech bringing us into this promised land.
I'm in agreement. I'm in agreement that it will take more than just a small group of elites or professionals to be able to push the movement. And for anyone to wait for them and to think that that's what's necessary, then, I mean, I had once thought, like Brian had, I thought we might need to take over, or have people come onto this side. But when would that happen? And would that be the requirement or the key for us to move forward, if that's moving into this new era where tech is dominant and in use in everybody's lives, and so you just need a small group of people that will be able to have important decisions, and who knows how much there is to confide in small, just a few. And thinking over what you've said, yeah, it does require and will be needed for everyone's participation, whether you have those skills or not.
Yeah. And I would say it's different in terms of like, since I do believe tech is going to be used against us, to have a cadre of tech people on our side who are believers in our cause and the cause, who are going to try to undo their system, who are going to create problems for them, that's a very different thing. That the act of fighting against our opponents, and a core of tech people who want to play a role in that, yeah, they just like any army, you have people who are going to play different roles within that army. So the act of dismantling their system, I can see. But if it's required for us to get to where we need to get to, that we require this special expertise and this tech stuff to get us there, then I don't believe in that revolution.
And if we did have folks that were part of the revolution, I think it would be important for those to share those skills, as well as any other skills that are needed, so that we can all work together and not just have some people wait on others to have those commodities, products, whatever it is that we might need. Um, yeah, back to Surveilled. I guess that is the eye-opening thing then. The solution to it is, without our phones, that's the one thing Ronan Farrow did give us
He
the
did.
solution to.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion.
Which I didn't expect.
I didn't
know.
expect it either. I didn't expect him to say that, and maybe that indicates that he does recognize it's a bigger problem than he seems to reveal in his movie, or documentary. But I have to give him that. He said that, and that's like, yeah, that's the solution. I mean, that's the beginning of the solution.
And the other thing I thought about that could be useful in this was, and maybe we'll have this clip, I'll find it, where, and you mentioned it, Israel does use Palestine as a hub or as a lab to be able to do their experiments. If you think how ironic that is, what the Jews went through during the Holocaust.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of irony there, unfortunately, there.
But I thought about Michael Caine when he mentioned it was just a turf war, and I thought, no, it's not just a turf war, and if anyone should hear what that clip does give us, is it has always been, the space for experiments on the Palestinian people, which is why they're so successful at what they do as well, and maybe then we can do further exploration, which I'd like to do, how this has affected, because that's what I wanted to share, other people in their that are maybe more closer to us. In my case, what happens here in Mexico and in the USA, what happens in law enforcement and citizens being spied on.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the next thing that we could explore. But it does leave us with that, okay, and how does this affect me in my personal life over here where I'm at? Because this film will be mostly watched in Western sort of first world countries.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll be watched in Iran, for example.
Yeah.
So,
if I was to say one thing two things I didn't know about. I didn't know about Citizen Lab, which I thought was an interesting thing that these people were doing to.
maybe that's the cadre that we could recruit.
Yeah, like that that'd be worth reaching out to them and see what they, that'd be interesting. There's somebody we could interview there. But the other thing that was interesting was when he had found out that when NSO sells their Pegasus software, that they would maybe sell it to Western countries for like 10 million, but they would sell it to Saudi Arabia for 250 million, and so that was one of the reasons why NSO was a little reluctant when it was found out that Saudi Arabia or Qatar is using this in a bad way. There's a major financial reason that NSO is not going to say, oh, well, you can't use this because here are our terms of agreement and blah, blah, blah. Because they themselves are already selling it vastly more to, like, at a vastly higher price to, in their opinion, governments that are going to more likely misuse it. So that was interesting. I didn't know about that.
As well as that no one's devices are, I was thinking, no one's devices are at, what do you call it, spyware proof from cyber espionage.
Yeah.
Governments, even within their own, their officials, I imagine, that government phones or anyone who, as a representative or some sort of politician, has their device cleaned or looked at by some by people who are in tech and take care of this. but even they're not even able to take care of that. So that means that the rest of us are at risk.
Right.
So that's
And
not new, but it is definitely something for us to keep watch over.
and we learned if we thought our computer or our phone was currently being tapped by a outside program, what might you, if you knew who to go to, what would you do with that device?
You wrap it up in aluminium.
Aluminum, right? They made a Faraday cage around it. Yeah. So do
I was
that.
just going to ask you if you could give us, as someone who teaches physics, what that does or why.
My best understanding of that is, so they call it a Faraday cage. And the way I've heard of Faraday cages is more like how to make yourself immune to a lightning bolt. Like if you're inside of a car is like an all metal, say, car, and that car gets hit by a lightning bolt, and you're inside the car, are you going to get hurt? No, because the lightning, the electricity hits the metal, it gets conducted throughout the metal and will largely go into the ground. So that electricity never touches the inside contents. And I think that's what they're implying is going to happen to the electromagnetic signal coming through the metal, is that the metal is essentially absorbing it, or maybe that's what they're kind of talking about here. And so that, I think if that works, they're kind of implying, it's my understanding, that a signal to stop the program or that they would need to be sent externally can no longer get into it, because that signal will be taken up into the conductive material of the aluminum that's around it, and then go into the earth, because it's not going to get into the computer. So that's my best understanding of that, using the analogy of lightning and why a person inside of a car is generally going to be safe, if it gets hit. And same with a plane. A plane is like a giant Faraday cage. Or if you were around something very electrically dangerous, and like it could arc towards you, but if you were in all full chainmail, you'd be fine. Like it would arc towards you and would go from the chainmail into the ground. So, and you don't even have to be plate mail. It could be chainmail. Like it would just go through the metal, and you wouldn't feel any charge on you. So that's called a Faraday cage.
I guess you could continue believing in the tinfoil hats.
Right. But there's a reason for that stuff. I mean, there's a reason that they talk about tinfoil as a means of blocking signals. It's not crazy. I mean, so.
It's an inside joke that I used to joke with Andy when we were beginning to look into conspiracies. I didn't want to be a conspiracy
You did
kind
not.
of podcast.
Yeah,
And then he was like, I'll go with my tinfoil hat.
Exactly. I was prepared to wear one. Those were more innocent days. Neither of us knew how bad it was, basically.
I didn't realize how bad it was then.
But even I, as a person who was much more into conspiracies, had a lot to how deep some of these things went. And I'm still learning, like, weather engineering and HARP, and who knows who started these fires in LA,
I just remember you mentioning those things, and I would just be like, no, we cannot go in. We can't prove those things. We mustn't be that kind of people.
Yeah. Well, you've changed a lot on that, Eduardo.
I have. Anyhow, is there anything else we should be adding to this?
One last question. So my statement is, I would not recommend I wouldn't recommend this to people who are new at this surveillance stuff, like who haven't heard about it. Would I recommend it to people who know a lot about it? I'd say no. I think you're going to be bored. So I'll just say I don't really think there's any reason to watch this movie for anybody. And I want you to answer that question. Is there a group because I wouldn't show this to my students. I wouldn't show it to somebody who I was trying to begin to introduce surveillance to. I want to see if how you feel about that. Are there people you might say, no, I'd say, hey, check this out.
I suppose anyone that is just at beginner's level, but I mean, there are other films, other documentaries that could be shared, or even just a few videos from our own episodes or Alison McDowell's if we wanted to really go into depth. But it does take a long time to finally come to a conclusion that we're being surveilled.
Right.
And asking questions about how do you manage this? And no one has the answer. You can't. And there's going to be consequences with this. And so that's what this film is about, to tell you those things. So if anyone, it would just be very, 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 very basic info on what's happening out in the world. Things that we've already been revealed by Julian Assange and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. And then others. So
others as well. That I should make my list for those as well.
Yeah. One last thing. I thought it was interesting when he was talking to the dude he was being interviewed by, and he was saying, like, well, the US government is agreed to not use Pegasus or commercial stuff. And then the dude said, but don't they have their own stuff? And he was like, well, I guess, he was just, I just think Ronan is he's very new to this whole thing. He just wasn't prepared to deal with this material. So maybe that makes me feel better about him, because part of me thinks he's just trying to fool people at one level. And I don't think so. I just think he's like a babe in the woods on this whole area.
He took years doing this.
Do what?
He took years in this investigative report.
He needs to watch some Jake Kleisik. He needs to read a Jake Kleisik book, or watch some of the early Alison McDowell stuff. And I think then maybe he can come back to this material.
Yeah. One other area that I think he never mentioned was when he was interviewing folk, I was waiting for him to say, I've been spied on.
Right.
He never talked about his experience. He said it in the very beginning.
Yeah.
But when he was interviewing folk, he should have said, but I imagine he's like, as a journalist, I didn't want to be biased. But he had to say, you keep talking about criminals being spied on. You keep talking about this, but what about regular folk being spied on, like myself?
Yeah. Yep.
He didn't mention his own experience.
Yep.
So I don't know how he didn't go aggressive on the people he interviewed.
He didn't. So
anyhow.
But I will say, Eduardo, I'm glad we did this episode. I think I think we actually did a movie review this time. Like, we reviewed the movie, even though we're not showing clips. I don't think so much. Before, we didn't review the movie as much when we've done movies like Planet of the Humans or something. I think that was one. But I think we actually did a movie review. And the fact that it wasn't just you who suggested this, but Derek Rose gave me additional reason to be like, okay. But I'm glad we watched it, because it's worth it to kind of see where I'm at on this stuff. So I don't feel like it's a waste of time to watch the movie, but I didn't waste the time watching it so I could talk with you about it. That's what I would say.
At least they gave us a way to measure our growth.
Yeah, I would say so. Right. I would agree with that.
We've grown.
Yeah.
We're beyond this.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. All right. I was hoping something else would be there, but it's fine. You could criticize it.
Well,
something I suggested.
I'm surprised that Derek Rose recommended this movie. I am surprised. I'm like, what did he see in it? Because you recommended it before seeing it. He saw it and then said that people should see it. I'm like, I'm surprised.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why he recommended it after seeing it. I'd see it. And thank you for sharing the link.
Yep.
All right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode, or on our blog, Whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you fancy anything you've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of the platforms on the Spotify, iTunes Podcast, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes where we found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, such as a film, documentary, something, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson, and you can always check us out in the next episode. Thank you all for listening. Ciao.
Bye-bye.